Walk into any convenience store, petrol station, or supermarket in Australia, and you will find Red Bull, Monster, V Mother, and a growing catalogue of similar products sitting at eye level, often positioned near the checkout, often sold in multi-packs and larger formats, explicitly designed to increase the volume purchased per transaction. They are colourful, aggressively marketed through extreme sports sponsorships and social media, and in Australia, they are available to any child of any age who has the money to buy them. There is no law preventing a 10-year-old from purchasing a 500 milliliter can of Monster Energy, which contains 160 milligrams of caffeine, approximately the equivalent of 1.5 standard instant coffees. There is no law preventing a 12-year-old from buying 2 cans of Red Bull at a servo on the way to school. There is a label. The label says not recommended for children, pregnant or lactating women, or individuals sensitive to caffeine. That, as of March 2026, is the entirety of Australia's child protection framework for high caffeine energy drinks. A label, a recommendation, no enforcement, no minimum age, no mechanism for refusal. This investigation examines what the available science says about these products and children specifically, what a growing number of countries have done in legislative response to that science, and why Australia's current regulatory position looks increasingly difficult to defend against the weight of evidence that has accumulated over the past decade. The product category is defined in Australia under Standard 2.6.4 of the Australia-New Zealand Food Standards Code as formulated caffeinated beverages. The Food Standards Code imposes a maximum of 80 milligrams of caffeine per 250 milliliters on these products, which is the same caffeine level as approximately 1 cup of instant coffee. That sounds like a modest and protective limit until you consider that the standard only regulates caffeine concentration, not the volume of the container. A standard 250 milliliter can of Red Bull contains 80 milligrams of caffeine, which is within the permitted maximum. A 500 milliliter can contains approximately 160 milligrams, which is also within the maximum because the concentration is the same, just doubled by the larger format. Energy drink manufacturers have responded to this regulatory structure by progressively increasing the volume of their standard retail formats. As the Western Australian Department of Health notes directly in its energy drink information materials, there are no regulations on the volume of retail units, which means the total caffeine dose available to a consumer is limited only by how large a container the manufacturer chooses to sell. In practice, this means a child can walk out of a corner store with a single can delivering more caffeine than 2 cups of coffee, with no legal barrier to the transaction and no obligation on the retailer to refuse the sale. Food Standards Australia New Zealand has established a reference value for children and adolescents under 18 of 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight per day. For a 40 kilogram child, the kind of body weight common in children aged around 10 to 11, that translates to a daily reference ceiling of 120 milligrams of caffeine. A single 500 milliliter can of Monster Energy, which delivers approximately 160 milligrams of caffeine, already exceeds that daily reference ceiling for that child in a single product before tea, chocolate, cola drinks, or any other dietary caffeine source is counted. Tea, cola drinks, chocolate, and other foods all contribute caffeine to a child's daily intake. FSANZ's own expert analysis concluded that increased anxiety levels in children begin to emerge at intakes of approximately 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day, which is precisely the level used as the reference value. In other words, the reference value is not a comfortable safety margin. It is the threshold at which adverse effects begin to be observed. There is no comfortable buffer between the dose available in commercially sold Australian energy drinks and the dose at which documented health effects in children begin to appear in the research literature. The health evidence connecting energy drink consumption in young people to a range of adverse outcomes has been accumulating for more than a decade and is now substantial enough to have driven binding legislative change in multiple countries, including several within the European Union. Peer-reviewed research associates regular energy drink consumption in children and adolescents with disrupted sleep patterns, increased anxiety, elevated blood pressure, and in some studies impaired concentration and academic performance. These are not theoretical risks derived from implausibly high experimental doses. They are documented outcomes observed at the consumption levels that real Australian children are demonstrably achieving in their daily lives. Research published in Australian context studies has found that energy drink consumption among adolescents clusters with other unhealthy behaviors, including short sleep duration and poor dietary patterns, suggesting that the products are being used precisely as the marketing positions them, as a compensatory stimulant to substitute for adequate rest that is not being taken, and critically, as a product whose marketing actively discourages the behavioral changes that would make the stimulant unnecessary. A teenager who is sleep deprived from late nights, who relies on an energy drink on the way to school to feel functional, and who then experiences an afternoon caffeine crash that contributes to further disrupted sleep the following night, is not an edge case. It is the primary use pattern that the products are commercially engineered to sustain. Shay Evans, a 20-year-old from Western Australia who began consuming energy drinks at 15 when she started full-time work, described the experience precisely. By the time she stopped, she was dependent. Not having one produced headaches, having one no longer produced alertness. The product had delivered its commercial objective, a loyal repeat customer, at the direct cost of her relationship with her own baseline energy level. That is not an unusual outcome. It is the intended one. The international regulatory response to this body of evidence is instructive. Latvia banned the sale of high-caffeine energy drinks to anyone under 18 in 2016. Lithuania followed with the same restriction in the same year. Poland introduced an under-18 ban in January 2024. Estonia implemented its own under-18 ban in January 2024. Norway passed legislation in 2023 with an under-16 restriction coming into force in January 2026. In England, the government announced a consultation in September 2025 on banning sales of high-caffeine energy drinks to children under 16, with government documentation estimating the measure could prevent obesity in up to 40,000 children and deliver health benefits worth tens of millions of pounds. The English government's consultation specifically noted that up to 1/3 of children aged 13 to 16 were consuming at least one high-caffeine energy drink each week, and that approximately 100,000 children across England were consuming one or more of these products on a daily basis. England and Wales define a child as anyone under 18, making the proposed under 16 restriction explicitly an acknowledgement that protective legislation in this area is overdue even before it reaches the full adult threshold. The pattern across these jurisdictions is consistent. Countries that have examined the evidence have moved toward age-based restrictions rather than label-based recommendations. The direction of travel across the developed world is clear, and Australia has not yet moved with it. Australia's position in this context requires some unpacking, because the industry's preferred framing is that Australia already has some of the most stringent regulations on energy drinks in the world. That claim refers to the compositional and labeling standards under Standard 2.6. 4. The maximum caffeine concentration, the mandatory advisory statements, the restriction on certain additives. Those standards are genuinely detailed and represent a meaningful framework for product composition. What they do not do is restrict the sale of these products to children in any legally enforceable way. The Australian Beverages Council, which represents non-alcoholic drinks producers, including energy drink manufacturers, has published voluntary industry commitments that include not directing advertising and marketing activities at children and not selling energy drinks in primary or secondary schools. These voluntary commitments are meaningful in the narrow sense that some manufacturers have chosen to adopt them. They are also entirely unenforceable, apply only to manufacturers who are members of the council, rather than to all Australian retailers and distributors, and explicitly leave open every commercial channel that is not a school, a supermarket, a petrol station, a convenience store, a milk bar, an online delivery platform. None of these are covered by the voluntary school restriction. The child who cannot buy an energy drink from the school canteen can buy one from the convenience store on the walk home, and no one at that store is obligated to ask their age or decline the sale. The label telling them not to is the only intervention between the product and the purchase. In February 2023, The town of Bridgetown in Western Australia implemented a voluntary local ban on the sale of energy drinks to anyone under 18 as part of a community health trial. The town's experience was widely covered as a novelty, a small community taking matters into its own hands in the absence of national legislation. That framing inadvertently illustrates the problem. When a regional town in the southwest of Western Australia has moved further ahead of the regulatory curve than the national government, something has gone wrong with the policy development process at the national level. The public health case for age-based restrictions on high-caffeine energy drinks is not new, not seriously contested within the relevant scientific literature, and not difficult to access. A 2025 FSANZ assessment noted that when looking at energy, electrolyte, and fortified drinks combined, these beverages contributed only 1 to 4% of total caffeine intake in young age groups across the population, a finding the Australian Beverages Council has cited as evidence that the concern is overstated. That figure is a population average that masks highly unequal distribution. It captures the many children who consume no energy drinks alongside the children who consume multiple cans per day. The child consuming 2 or more energy drinks daily is not meaningfully protected by a statistic describing average population intake. They are the child for whom the label recommendation carries no weight, for whom the voluntary school policy creates no barrier outside school hours, and for whom Australia currently offers no legal protection that a retailer is obligated to enforce. The question of what Australia should do in response to this body of evidence is ultimately a policy question for governments and regulators to resolve. But the information that informs that question is publicly available, well documented, and increasingly difficult to argue against without invoking the commercial interests of those who profit from the current absence of restrictions. England moved toward a ban after examining the same evidence available to Australian health authorities for years. Multiple European nations have already implemented restrictions that go further than anything currently on the table in Australia. The science connecting high-caffeine energy drink consumption in children and adolescents to disrupted sleep, anxiety, elevated blood pressure, and caffeine dependence is not speculative. The marketing architecture that positions these products as aspirational, performance-enhancing, and culturally associated with extreme sports, celebrity endorsement, and peer belonging is not accidental and is not primarily aimed at adults. The combination of those two things, potent stimulant products with no minimum purchase age, marketed directly at the demographic most susceptible to their effects, is not a situation that a label can meaningfully address. Every Australian parent who has watched a child pull an energy drink from a servo fridge and understood that the small print label advisory is the only line of defense between that product and that child is operating in a regulatory environment that is out of step with where the evidence points and where the rest of the developed world is moving, one age restriction law at a time.